In a mansion filled with luxury and silence, a reclusive millionaire seeks to fill the void of a life marked by guilt and loneliness. He hires a wheelchair-bound woman to keep him company, believing that money can buy even human connections. But she, a brilliant artist with an indomitable spirit, defies his expectations, refusing to be submissive or intimidated. What begins as a cold and calculated arrangement evolves into a confrontation of forces, truths, and secrets, as both discover that neither power nor pain defines who they really are. A story about redemption, courage, and the transformation that only the unexpected can bring. The Blackwood Mansion stood imposingly atop Beacon Hill in Boston, like a modern fortress of glass and concrete. From the top-floor windows, Jonathan Blackwood observed the city that had once been at his feet, now reduced to a distant sea of twinkling lights on the horizon. At 45, he had become a shadow of the magnate he once was, a man who preferred the solitude of his crystal tower to the bustle of social events he used to frequent with such pleasure. The sound of his footsteps echoed through the empty corridors as he followed his daily routine. The mansion, with its 20,000 square feet, seemed even larger since he had dismissed most of the staff, keeping only a butler, a housekeeper, and 2 security guards who alternated at the gatehouse. The walls, once decorated with valuable works of art, now displayed only lighter patches on the wallpaper, silent witnesses to a past of ostentation. Mr. Blackwood, the voice of George, his faithful butler of 2 decades, interrupted his thoughts. "You've barely touched your breakfast again." Jonathan adjusted the navy blue silk robe over his pajamas and dismissed the concern with a careless gesture. "I'm not hungry, George, and I've told you. You can call me Jonathan." "As you wish, sir." "Jonathan," George replied, hesitant. "But if I may be so bold, this solitude isn't doing you any good. It's been 3 years since the incident, and you hardly ever leave the house anymore." The incident, as George delicately referred to it, had been a financial scandal that shook the Blackwood empire. Jonathan hadn't been formally accused of anything, but his reputation had been irreparably tarnished. Longtime friends distanced themselves, invitations to events ceased, and even his fiancée at the time, Elizabeth, had found an elegant excuse to end the relationship. "Solitude is preferable to hypocrisy, my dear friend," Jonathan replied, pouring himself a glass of whiskey even though it was still morning. "At least here I know exactly where my enemies are, out there, all of them." But on this particular morning, something was different. Jonathan had spent the previous night reviewing old photos and newspaper clippings, immersing himself in memories of a time when his name was synonymous with success and innovation. The contrast with his current reality was too painful to ignore. He walked to his office, where a modern glass desk supported 3 monitors. On one of them, an old news report showed his last public appearance, when he had to face a crowd of reporters hungry for explanations. His face in that photo, tense and defensive, seemed to belong to someone else. "George," he suddenly called, an idea beginning to form in his mind. "Remember that TV show you mentioned last week? The one with people offering companionship in exchange for financial compensation?" The butler, who had not yet withdrawn, frowned. "Yes, sir, but I don't think—" "Contact them," Jonathan interrupted, his voice acquiring a decisive tone he hadn't shown in a long time. "But I have specific conditions. I want someone who really needs the money, someone who doesn't have connections to the media or the corporate world, and most importantly, someone who can't run away at the first sign of discomfort." "Sir, you're not suggesting—" "Exactly, George. Look for candidates with some physical limitation. Wheelchair users, preferably. Offer a 6-month contract with enough value to change someone's life. But be discreet. No public announcements or agencies. Use your contacts, do a thorough background check. I need someone who really needs this opportunity." George hesitated, clearly uncomfortable with the proposal. "Sir, forgive my frankness, but this doesn't seem ethical." Jonathan laughed, a humorless sound. "Ethical? The world wasn't very ethical to me, was it? Besides, I'm not proposing anything illegal. It will be a legitimate contract with mutual benefits. She will have comfort and financial security, and He paused, looking out the window. "I will have someone who can't flee at the first sign of confrontation." The butler remained silent for a few moments, processing the request. Finally, with a resigned sigh, he nodded. "As you wish, sir. I'll begin the search today." As George withdrew, Jonathan turned his attention back to the city below. For the first time in a long time, he felt energized, almost excited. It wasn't exactly a noble plan. He was aware of that, but it seemed like a pragmatic solution to his situation. After all, what could go wrong? It would be a simple agreement. Money in exchange for companionship. And with someone who, in his limited view, would be as isolated from the world as he was. Little did Jonathan know that his attempt to control yet another situation in his life was about to turn into the biggest challenge he had ever faced. The person George would find wouldn't just be hired company, but someone who would turn his world upside down, challenging each of his premises about control, power, and vulnerability. Sophia Carter's studio was filled with unfinished canvases, scattered brushes, and the characteristic smell of oil paint. At 32, she had transformed the small, adapted apartment in Brooklyn into her creative refuge. The walls, once white, now displayed a kaleidoscope of colors and textures, reflecting her restless soul and indomitable spirit. Seated in her specially adapted wheelchair, Sophia was putting the finishing touches on her latest work, a giant canvas depicting a moving crowd, where each face told a different story. Her skilled fingers manipulated the brush with surgical precision, adding layers of meaning to each stroke. "You really should consider the offer, Sophia," insisted Rachel, her best friend and art agent, as she leafed through a stack of papers. "The amount he's offering, it's more than we could get with 3 solo exhibitions." Sophia dipped her brush in water, watching the colors dissolve in hypnotic spirals. "Rach, are you suggesting that I basically become a hired companion, just because the guy is rich and willing to pay well?" "Don't be unfair," Rachel protested, adjusting her colorful framed glasses. "It's a legitimate work contract. He wants company for social events, someone to talk to, and you'd have your own space in the mansion. You could continue painting." "And why is he specifically looking for a wheelchair user?" Sophia interrupted, turning her chair to face her friend. "Doesn't that sound even a little suspicious to you?" Rachel sighed, sitting on the only free stool in the studio. "Look, I did my research. Jonathan Blackwood was one of the most influential businessmen in the country before the scandal. Now he lives practically as a recluse. Maybe he really just wants someone who understands what it's like to be different." Sophia laughed, a sound between amused and ironic. "Different? Rach, I'm not different. I'm an artist, an activist, and I happen to use a wheelchair. And you know very well that my condition is temporary. The doctors are optimistic about recovery." "Exactly why?" Rachel perked up. "The contract money could pay for the best treatments, the best therapies. 6 months, Sophia. It's only 6 months of your life." Sophia turned her attention to the canvas, contemplating weeks of work. Her last exhibition had been a critical success, but the sales, medical bills were piling up, and the experimental treatment her doctor had suggested was completely out of her financial reach. "How much?" she finally asked, her voice almost a whisper. Rachel slid a paper across the work table. When Sophia saw the number, her eyebrows involuntarily raised. It was an obscene amount, enough not only for her treatments but to finance her artistic projects for the next few years. "And he doesn't even want to meet me beforehand?" she questioned, still skeptical. "Actually," Rachel hesitated, "he wants to meet you tonight. A formal dinner at the mansion. His butler, George, will come to pick you up at 7 p.m. Adapted car and everything." Sophia turned her chair again, approaching the window that overlooked the busy Brooklyn street. The afternoon sun painted the sky in shades of orange and pink, colors she had so often tried to capture on her canvases. "You were already sure I'd accept, weren't you?" she asked, a reluctant smile forming on her lips. Rachel approached, resting a hand on her shoulder. "Actually, no. You're the most stubborn and independent person I know. But you're also pragmatic. And Sophia, you deserve this chance." After Rachel left, Sophia remained for a long time observing her unfinished canvas. The crowd she had painted seemed to look back at her, as if questioning her decision. Among the figures, there was one, in particular, that always caught her attention. A woman with her back turned, standing, looking towards the horizon. It was a disguised self-portrait, a promise to herself. At 6:45 p.m., Sophia was ready. She opted for an emerald green dress that highlighted her brown eyes and revealed the flower tattoo that snaked up her right arm. Her brown hair, usually tied in a messy bun, was loose, falling in soft waves to her shoulders. She wore no makeup beyond red lipstick, her trademark. When the doorbell rang, Sophia took a deep breath. "Let the show begin," she murmured to herself, turning her chair towards the door. She was about to meet the man who thought he could buy companionship and submission with money. Little did he know he was about to meet someone who would never bow to his will, no matter the price. The Blackwood mansion was even more impressive up close. Sophia observed the modernist construction through the car window as George, the butler, guided the adapted vehicle down the avenue of oak trees. The sun was setting behind the property, creating a dramatic effect on the glass walls that reflected the sky in fiery tones. "The access ramp was installed this afternoon, Miss Carter," George informed, his formal voice masking a tone of genuine consideration. "Mr. Blackwood insisted on ensuring your comfort." Sophia suppressed an ironic smile. How thoughtful of him. "I imagine it must have been the first time he thought about someone else's needs." George cleared his throat, uncomfortable but didn't respond. He parked the car near the main entrance, where an elegant metal and glass ramp had been installed, blending perfectly with the house's architecture. The interior of the mansion was a study in luxurious minimalism. Contemporary artworks vied for space with designer furniture. But Sophia immediately noticed the empty spaces on the walls, like scars on a blank canvas. Jonathan Blackwood awaited them in the spacious living room, a glass of red wine in one hand, wearing an impeccably tailored navy blue suit. "Miss Carter," he greeted her with a half smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Welcome to my humble abode." "Humble?" Sophia raised an eyebrow, maneuvering her chair skillfully through the environment. "I think we have very different definitions of that word, Mr. Blackwood." Jonathan observed her with poorly disguised interest. She was nothing like he had imagined. He expected someone more submissive, perhaps intimidated by the situation. Instead, he found a woman who looked at him as an equal, with a hint of challenge in her gaze. "Please call me Jonathan," he offered, indicating the already set dining table. "Shall we?" "I prefer to maintain formality, Mr. Blackwood," Sophia responded, positioning her chair at the table with precision. "After all, this is a negotiation, isn't it?" Jonathan sat at the head of the table, studying her for a few moments. "Straight to the point then, very well. I imagine your friend has already explained the basic terms of the contract to you." "Yes, she mentioned something about buying my freedom for 6 months," Sophia replied, tasting the wine that George had just served. "I must say I was curious to understand why a man of your position would resort to such peculiar methods to get company." Jonathan's smile faltered for a moment. "Peculiar? I'm offering a legitimate contract with mutual benefits. You'll have access to all the comforts of this house, plus more than generous financial compensation. And in return, you expect me to be your... what, exactly? Your display doll? Your living proof of charity?" The first course was served, an appetizer of grilled scallops with Sicilian lemon foam, as the tension grew between them. "You have a sharp tongue, Miss Carter," Jonathan commented, his voice controlled. "But no, I'm not looking for a display doll. I'm seeking intelligent company. Someone who can share the day-to-day of this house without the usual prejudices that people have about me." Sophia laughed, a crystalline sound that echoed through the environment. "And that's why you specifically looked for a wheelchair user? Did you think you'd find someone so desperate they'd accept anything? Or maybe someone who, as you told your team, couldn't run away?" Jonathan paled slightly. "I see you have your sources." "I have my methods," she replied, savoring the scallop with elegance. "Just as I'm fully aware of who you are, Mr. Blackwood." The fallen magnate, isolated in his ivory tower after a financial scandal that cost hundreds of people their jobs. "For you know nothing about that situation," Jonathan retorted, his voice hardening. "I know enough," Sophia continued, her green eyes fixed on his. "Just as I know that this absurd proposal is more a reflection of your desire for control than any genuine need for companionship." A heavy silence fell over the table, George, who was serving the main course, seemed to want to become invisible. "And yet," Jonathan finally spoke, "you're here." Sophia gently set down her cutlery. "I am. Because unlike what you imagine, I didn't come here out of desperation. I came by choice. And if I decide to accept your proposal, it will be on my terms." "Your terms?" Jonathan asked, a mixture of irritation and curiosity in his voice. "Exactly. First, I want a fully equipped studio with access to the garden. Second, I'll maintain my total independence to go out and carry out my personal projects. Third, the moment you try to control me or treat me like your property, our agreement ends." Jonathan observed her for long moments, divided between admiration and irritation. This woman was a complete enigma, the opposite of everything he expected, and surprisingly, this intrigued him. "And if I don't accept your terms?" he provoked. Sophia smiled, pushing her chair back. "Then it was a pleasure to meet you, Mr. Blackwood. George, could you take me home, please?" "Wait," Jonathan called, as she was already heading towards the exit. "You're different." "No, Mr. Blackwood," she replied, turning her chair to face him one last time. "I am exactly who I am. The question is, are you prepared to deal with someone you can't buy or control?" The first week of coexistence in the Blackwood mansion was an exercise in patience for everyone involved. Sophia had settled in the east wing of the house, a spacious and luminous area that included an adapted suite and the promised studio. The large windows of the studio opened onto the garden, offering a privileged view of the sunset that she was already beginning to incorporate. Fain to her new canvases. "Breakfast is served at 8 a.m. sharp on the terrace," Jonathan had informed on the first day, his voice carrying that authoritative tone that so irritated Sophia. "I expect punctuality." To his surprise, Sophia appeared at 7:45 a.m. the next morning, impeccably dressed in a red pantsuit, her hair tied in an elegant bun. "Good morning, Mr. Blackwood," she greeted him with false sweetness. "I hope I haven't kept you waiting." Jonathan, who was still in his robe, seemed momentarily disconcerted. It was the first time someone had caught him off guard in his own home in years. The following days established a peculiar routine. Sophia devoted her mornings to painting, transforming the studio into her own universe. The afternoons were filled with work calls, physiotherapy sessions, which she had insisted on maintaining with her own therapist, and occasional clashes with Jonathan. "Your new canvas is interesting," Jonathan commented on one particular afternoon, observing the work in progress in the studio. The painting showed a solitary male figure surrounded by breaking mirrors. "Interesting." Sophia raised an eyebrow, cleaning a brush. "I thought a collector of your caliber would have a more elaborate artistic vocabulary. Forgive me if I can't decipher the depth behind breaking mirrors," he retorted, a touch of irony in his voice. "Maybe it's too literal." Sophia turned her chair to face him. "The mirrors aren't broken, Mr. Blackwood, they're breaking. There's a fundamental difference between a permanent state and an ongoing process. But I imagine someone so accustomed to seeing everything in black and white has difficulty with nuances." The comment hit Jonathan deeper than he would have liked to admit. In recent years, he had grown accustomed to seeing the world through simplistic lenses, allies or enemies, truth or lie, right or wrong. Sophia's presence was beginning to blur these carefully drawn lines. One day, during lunch, Sophia noticed something different in the dining room. "The empty spaces on the walls," she commented casually. "Were those works sold after the scandal?" Jonathan froze with his fork halfway to his mouth. "Are you always so direct in your questioning?" "Only when I perceive that someone is hiding behind evasive answers," she returned, keeping her gaze fixed on him. To her surprise, Jonathan put down his cutlery and sighed. "Some were sold, yes. Others were returned to their rightful owners." "Rightful owners?" Sophia gently pressed. "I discovered that some of the works in my collection had dubious provenance," he admitted, his voice almost a whisper. "Part of the scandal you so like to mention." Sophia observed him with renewed attention. It was the first time he had shown anything beyond arrogance or defensiveness when talking about the past. "You know," she began, her voice softer, "sometimes we need to empty the walls to fill them with something new, something truly ours. Jonathan stared at her, surprised by the change in her tone. For a moment, the air between them seemed charged, with something different from the usual tension. The moment was broken by the sound of Sophia's cell phone. It was Rachel, her agent. "An exhibition?" Sophia asked on the phone, her face lighting up. "Of course I'm interested." Jonathan watched as she discussed details of the proposal, noticing how her eyes shone with genuine enthusiasm. It was a side of her he hadn't seen yet, passionate, focused, completely in her element. "I need to go to the gallery tomorrow," Sophia announced after hanging up. "There's a curator interested in my work for a group exhibition, but tomorrow we have lunch with the foundation board," Jonathan protested automatically. Sophia raised her eyebrows. "Mr. Blackwood, I think I've made it clear that my career is not up for negotiation. The lunch will have to be without me." "Are you here to keep me company?" he argued, his voice hardening. "No, I'm here because we made an agreement, and part of that agreement is maintaining my independence," she responded firmly. "Besides, I thought you'd prefer to have someone with their own life by your side, instead of just another trophy in your collection." Her words hit him like a slap. Jonathan abruptly stood up from the table, his napkin falling to the floor. "Do as you wish," he said dryly, leaving the room. Later that same night, Jonathan found her standing in front of her unfinished canvas in the studio. He was facing away from the door, hands in his pockets, contemplating the breaking mirrors with an intensity she had never seen before. "The mirrors," he spoke without turning, sensing her presence. "They're not just breaking, are they? They're revealing something behind." Sophia smiled slightly, surprised by his perception. "Maybe you're not as oblivious to nuances as I thought," she responded, letting the phrase hang in the air as she quietly withdrew, leaving Jonathan alone with his thoughts and the fragmented reflections of his own image on the canvas. The exhibition at the Visionary Gallery in the heart of Soho was packed. Sophia moved gracefully among the guests, her black dress contrasting with the chrome wheelchair she had chosen especially for the occasion. Her new works, including the now finished canvas of Breaking Mirrors, attracted curious looks and admiring comments. "Your technique evolves with each exhibition," commented Olivia Pearson, the renowned curator who had organized the event. "But there's something different in these works. A new intensity, almost disturbing." Sophia smiled, accepting a glass of champagne from a passing waiter. "Let's say I've been having intense experiences lately." "I imagine living with Jonathan Blackwood is quite an experience," Olivia commented casually, lowering her voice. Sophia froze, the glass halfway to her lips. "How did you—" "The art world is small, darling," Olivia replied with an enigmatic smile, "especially for those of us who have navigated the corporate corridors." Before Sophia could respond, a familiar figure emerged from the crowd. Michael Thornton, Jonathan's ex-partner and current CEO of Blackwood Enterprises' biggest rival. Tall, elegant, and with a calculated smile, he approached the two women. "Sophia Carter," he pronounced her name as if savoring each syllable. "What a pleasant surprise to find you here, still fighting corporate giants with your brushes." "Michael," Sophia responded coldly. "Still destroying family businesses to build your empires?" Olivia, sensing the tension, discreetly moved away, leaving the two alone. "I heard you're living with Jonathan," Michael continued, ignoring her hostility. "Interesting choice for someone who used to be so combative against questionable business practices." "My art has always been about exposing inconvenient truths," Sophia retorted. "Some people learn from their mistakes, others persist in them." Michael leaned in closer, his expensive perfume invading her personal space. "You know, I always wondered how an artist had access to that information about the Asian contracts. You had an inside source, didn't you?" Sophia maintained a neutral expression, but her heart raced. That investigation 3 years ago had exposed a scheme of overpricing that hit several companies, including Blackwood Enterprises. Her paintings, seemingly abstract, contained codes and references that, when deciphered, revealed details that the press had never managed to discover. "Art is interpretation, Michael," she responded serenely. "People see what they want to see. People also say what they shouldn't when they're vulnerable," he insinuated, his eyes fixing on the wheelchair. It must be difficult to keep secrets when you depend on others. Are you threatening me, Michael? Imagine that. Just a friendly observation. After all, Jonathan is an old friend. It would be terrible if he discovered he's harboring the very person who contributed to his downfall. At that moment, a familiar voice interrupted the conversation. "Miss Carter?" It was George, the butler, standing respectfully a few steps away. "Mr. Blackwood requests your presence at the mansion. It seems urgent." Sophia had never been so happy to see the butler. "If you'll excuse me, Michael. Duty calls." Of course, he smiled, that predatory smile that Sophia knew well. "Send my regards to Jonathan. Tell him that soon we'll have much to discuss." During the journey back to the mansion, Sophia remained silent, her mind working furiously. Michael Thornton had always been a shadowy figure in the corporate world, known for his aggressive tactics and lack of scruples. If he was interested in her connection with Jonathan, something bigger was at stake. Upon arriving at the mansion, she found Jonathan in the office, surrounded by papers and with a tense expression on his face. "Did something happen?" she asked, noticing his agitation. Jonathan looked up, seeming to notice her presence for the first time. "Michael Thornton was at your exhibition." It wasn't a question. "How did you—" "I have my contacts," he answered dryly. "What did he want?" Sophia hesitated. Should she tell Jonathan about the veiled threats? About her role in the events of 3 years ago? Just to provoke, she opted for a half-truth. "He seems to have a peculiar interest in our arrangement." Jonathan stood up, walking to the window. Michael never wastes time with pointless provocations. "He's plotting something." "Why do you care?" Sophia asked softly. "I thought you had left the corporate world behind." Jonathan turned to face her, and for the first time, Sophia saw something different in his eyes, not arrogance or bitterness, but genuine concern. "Because Michael Thornton isn't just my old rival," he answered slowly. "He's the man who orchestrated my downfall. And if he's interested in you, Sophia, it's because he's discovered something he can use against both of us." The silence that followed was heavy with unspoken meanings. Sophia observed Jonathan, noticing the lines of tension in his face, the invisible weight he carried. There was more to this story than she had imagined, layers of secrets and betrayals that were beginning to emerge. "Jonathan," she spoke, using his first name for the first time, "I think we need to have a serious conversation." He nodded slowly, pouring 2 glasses of whiskey. "Yes, we do. Because I have a feeling there's much more to your story than just an artist looking for opportunities." Sophia accepted the offered glass, aware that she was about to cross a line of no return. The truth, like the mirrors in her painting, was about to break, revealing reflections that perhaps neither of them was prepared to face. The office was plunged into a cozy penumbra, illuminated only by the modernist design lamp and the last rays of the setting sun that infiltrated through the windows. Jonathan and Sophia faced each other in silence, each holding their glass of whiskey like a protective shield against the truths that were about to be revealed. "Where do you want to start?" Sophia asked, breaking the dense silence that had settled between them. Jonathan swirled the amber liquid in his glass, thoughtful. "How about from the beginning? How did an artist get involved in a corporate investigation that destroyed some of the country's largest companies?" Sophia took a deep breath, adjusting her position in the chair. "My art has always been about exposing inconvenient truths. 3 years ago, I received an anonymous envelope with documents about irregularities in international contracts. At first, I thought about handing everything over to the press, but you discovered that art could be a more powerful weapon," Jonathan completed, a glimmer of understanding in his eyes. "Exactly. I created a series of works that apparently were just abstract paintings. But each element, each color code, each geometric pattern contained specific information about the illegal operations. When the exhibition opened, specialized journalists began to decipher the codes," Jonathan continued, rising from his armchair. "I remember the chaos that ensued. Every day, a new revelation, a new scandal. Companies were falling like dominoes." Sophia watched him walk to the window, his silhouette cut against the night sky. "Your company was one of the last to fall. Because I was one of the only ones who really didn't know anything, he replied bitterly, turning to face her. Michael was responsible for the entire international operation. He used my trust, my signature on documents I barely read. And when everything came to light, he had already protected himself, transferring all the blame to me. Why didn't you defend yourself? Jonathan let out a humorless laugh. With what evidence? Michael was meticulous. Every compromising document had my signature. Every questionable decision could be traced back to me. He built his trap over years, patiently, like a spider weaving its web. Sophia felt a tightness in her chest. The bitterness in Jonathan's voice was palpable, too real to be faked. "And your condition?" he suddenly asked, catching her by surprise. "Does it also have something to do with this whole story?" It was Sophia's turn to look away. "Yes. After the exhibition was inaugurated, I started receiving threats. One night, returning from the studio," she paused, taking a deep breath. "Let's say some accidents aren't really accidents." Jonathan quickly approached, kneeling beside her chair. "Michael, I could never prove it, but 3 days later I received flowers at the hospital with a card that said, 'Art imitates life, but sometimes life charges its price.'" The silence that followed was deafening. Jonathan slowly stood up, his face a mask of contained emotions. "Why did you agree to come here?" he finally asked, "knowing who I was, what my company did." "Because I needed to understand," Sophia answered simply. "I needed to see for myself. If you were the villain everyone painted or just another piece in Michael's game." Jonathan stared at her for a long time. "And what's your verdict?" "I'm still deciding," she smiled slightly. "But I think you're more like the breaking mirrors in my painting than you imagine. There's much more behind the reflections that people see." At that moment, Jonathan's cell phone vibrated with a message. His face paled as he read the content. "Michael is calling an extraordinary meeting of the old Blackwood Enterprises board," he announced, his voice tense. "Apparently, new evidence about the scandal has emerged." Sophia felt a shiver run down her spine. "He's going to use my connection to the case against you." "Against both of us," Jonathan corrected, surprising her with the inclusion. "He must have discovered about your anonymous source." "Jonathan," Sophia called softly, making him look in her direction. "There's something I need to tell you about those documents." Before she could continue, they were interrupted by urgent knocks on the door. It was George, with a worried expression on his face. "Sir, forgive the intrusion, but Miss Elizabeth is here. She says it's urgent." Jonathan and Sophia exchanged surprised looks. Elizabeth, the ex-fiancée who had abandoned him at the height of the scandal, had chosen a peculiarly convenient moment to reappear. "Send her in," Jonathan decided after a moment of hesitation. Sophia made a motion to withdraw, but he stopped her with a gesture. "Stay, please. I think we'll need each other to face what's coming." As Elizabeth's footsteps approached down the hall, Sophia observed a subtle change in Jonathan. His posture was different, more determined, as if the weight of the revelations, instead of crushing him, had given him a new purpose. "We need to stop Michael," he murmured, more to himself than to her, "before he destroys more lives." Sophia nodded silently, her mind already working on possibilities. The game was about to change, and this time they would have to be smarter than their adversary. Art and business were about to meet in a way that neither of them could have predicted. Elizabeth entered the office like a gust of wind, her emerald green silk dress swirling around her. At 38, she was still as stunning as Sophia knew her from old Society magazine photos, but there was something different in her eyes, a glimmer of urgency, almost fear. "Jonathan, She stopped abruptly upon noticing Sophia. "I didn't know. You had company." "Sophia is my guest," Jonathan responded, maintaining a neutral tone. "And anything you have to say can be said in her presence." Elizabeth hesitated, studying Sophia with poorly disguised curiosity. "You're the artist of the denunciation paintings, aren't you? I saw your exhibition 3 years ago." "And you're—" "The ex-fiancée who abandoned Jonathan when he needed support the most," Sophia responded, with a polite but cutting smile. "Sophia," Jonathan gently warned, although a glimmer of amusement danced in his eyes. "No, she's right," Elizabeth sighed, letting herself fall into an armchair. "That's exactly what I did. and that's why I'm here now. I need to fix a mistake from the past before it's too late." Jonathan approached, his posture tense. "What are you talking about?" "Michael is planning something big," she revealed, her hands trembling slightly. "Something that goes beyond simply destroying what's left of your reputation, Jonathan. He wants to take total control of the companies that are still under your indirect influence." "How do you know this?" Sophia asked, moving her chair closer. Elizabeth stared at her for a long time before answering. "Because for the past 2 years I've been close to Michael, close enough to have access to information he wouldn't share with anyone else." The silence that followed was heavy. Jonathan had turned to the window, his back as rigid as a statue. "Have you got involved with Michael?" His voice came out controlled, but Sophia could feel the underlying tension. "It was a strategic decision," Elizabeth answered, raising her chin. "Someone needed to keep an eye on him, discover his plans, and I owed you that, Jonathan." Sophia observed the scene with growing interest. There was more to this story than simple remorse or attempt at redemption. "What exactly is Michael planning?" she intervened, redirecting the conversation. "He discovered about your anonymous source," Elizabeth turned to Sophia. "And more than that, he knows that the original documents still exist. Documents that can prove he was the true architect of the entire scheme. How did he—" Sophia began, but was interrupted by Jonathan. "Your former assistant," he suddenly turned. "Amanda Ross. She worked for Michael before going to Blackwood Enterprises, didn't she?" Sophia felt a chill run down her spine. Amanda had been her assistant during the preparation of the controversial exhibition. She had access to the studio, to the codes in the paintings. "She never knew the origin of the documents," Sophia stated firmly. "But she knew where you kept them," Elizabeth completed. "Michael convinced her to come back to work for him 6 months ago. That's when things started to change. He became obsessed with discovering the connection between you and Jonathan." Jonathan approached Sophia, instinctively positioning himself at her side. "What else did you discover?" "The board meeting is a trap," Elizabeth revealed. "Michael has forged evidence linking you two to the original scandal. He's going to claim that Sophia was hired by Jonathan to create a smokescreen, exposing only convenient parts of the scheme." "That's ridiculous," Sophia protested. "I had never met Jonathan before coming here." "The truth doesn't matter to Michael," Jonathan spoke bitterly. "He just needs to plant doubt. Once suspicion is there—" "Exactly," Elizabeth agreed. "And there's more. He's preparing a dossier on your current agreement. The way you specifically looked for a person with a disability, the amounts involved. He's going to turn this into a scandal of devastating proportions." Sophia felt her blood run cold, not for herself but for the impact this would have on other people with disabilities who really needed legitimate opportunities. "I won't allow him to use my condition as a weapon," she declared, her voice laden with determination. Jonathan observed her with a new expression, admiration perhaps. "No, we won't allow it, but we need to be smarter than him." "The original documents," Elizabeth intervened. "If we could find them—" "No," Sophia cut in firmly. "That would only prove there was a leak of confidential information. We need something bigger, something Michael isn't expecting." A glimmer of understanding appeared in Jonathan's eyes. "Your paintings," he murmured. "The codes, the hidden messages. What if we created something new?" Sophia smiled slowly, her mind already working on the possibilities. "Something that would only make sense when all the pieces were together." "What are you talking about?" Elizabeth asked, confused. "Art," Sophia answered simply. "The same weapon I used to expose the truth 3 years ago, but this time it will be different. This time it will be a trap for Michael himself." Jonathan moved even closer to her chair, his eyes fixed on hers. "How much time do you need?" "The meeting is in 3 days," Elizabeth reminded. "Then we have 3 days to create a masterpiece," Sophia declared, her voice filled with determination. "Jonathan, I need access to all your files from the time of the scandal. Elizabeth, can you get current information on Michael's operations?" Both nodded, and for the first time since this whole story began, Sophia felt they had a real chance of victory. One last thing, Elizabeth spoke, standing up. Michael has an informant here in the mansion, someone who has been reporting your every move. Jonathan and Sophia exchanged concerned looks. The circle of people around them was small, which made the betrayal even more painful. "Did you find out who it is?" Jonathan asked. "Not yet," Elizabeth answered, walking to the door. "But be careful, Jonathan. Not all friends are what they seem." After her departure, Jonathan and Sophia remained silent for a few moments, processing all the information. "Do you trust her?" Sophia finally asked. "Not completely," Jonathan admitted. "But I think this time she's telling the truth. What worries me is this informant." "Well," Sophia smiled, a determined glint in her eyes, "I think it's time we give this spy something really interesting to report, don't you think?" Sophia's studio had transformed into an operations center over the last 2 days. Canvases in different stages of completion occupied every available space, all covered by cloths to protect their content from curious eyes. In the center of the room, a giant canvas of 10 by 7 feet dominated the space, still blank, waiting for the right moment. "Are you sure this will work?" Jonathan asked, watching Sophia prepare her paints with meticulous precision. She had insisted on using only special pigments, imported from Italy for this particular work. "Do you trust me?" she replied, without taking her eyes off her work, measuring drops of a transparent liquid into each color. Jonathan hesitated for only a second. "Surprisingly, yes," Sophia smiled, finally looking at him. "Then relax and let me work my magic. Did you bring the documents I asked for?" He nodded, placing a folder on the table. "Everything I could recover from the archives of that time." Elizabeth also sent some interesting information about Michael's current operations. "Great. And what about our little show for our mysterious spy?" "George reported that the new maid spent too much time near the office this morning, apparently. Cleaning the same area several times," Jonathan replied, an ironic smile on his lips. "She must have heard our heated discussion about your supposed blackmail." Sophia laughed, remembering the scene they had staged earlier. "You were very convincing, yelling about how I was trying to extort you. I almost believed it for a moment." "Years of corporate meetings taught me something about theater," he joked, but his smile soon disappeared. "Sophia, about what you were trying to tell me before Elizabeth arrived." "Not now," she gently interrupted. "Everything in its own time. First, we need to make sure Michael takes the bait." As if invoked by her words, Jonathan's cell phone vibrated with a message. "Michael just called a press conference for after the board meeting," he informed, his face tense. "Perfect," Sophia smiled, surprising him. "It's exactly what we needed. The bigger the audience, the bigger the impact." She turned her chair to a side table where several sketches were spread out. "Look at this," she called Jonathan. Each of these seemingly abstract images contains specific information about Michael's operations. But unlike last time, when I used only color codes and shapes, now I'm adding an extra element. Jonathan leaned over the drawings, fascinated. "The special pigments." "Exactly. Under normal light, people will see only an abstract work of art. But under ultraviolet light..." She picked up a small UV flashlight and pointed it at one of the sketches. Immediately, hidden patterns and symbols began to glow on the paper's surface. "Impressive," Jonathan murmured. "But how will we ensure this is revealed at the right moment?" "Leave that to me," Sophia smiled mysteriously. "I just need you to make sure the press conference happens in the Grand Hall of Blackwood Enterprises. The one with the large glass windows? Can you do this in time? If you stop distracting me with questions, yes," she teased, but her eyes were serious. "Jonathan, you know that once we start this, there's no turning back, right? Michael will come at us with everything he's got." Jonathan approached, kneeling beside her chair to be at eye level with her. "He's already coming at us with everything. At least this time I'm not alone in the fight." The moment between them lingered, charged with unspoken emotions. Sophia felt her heart race with his proximity, with the intensity of his gaze. "There's something else you need to know," she began, her voice almost a whisper. "About my condition." A noise at the door interrupted them. It was Rachel, carrying a stack of folders. "Sorry," she exclaimed, blushing as she realized the intimacy of the moment she had broken. "I brought the information you asked for about the international galleries, Sophia." Jonathan quickly stood up, clearing his throat. "I'll check on the preparations for tomorrow," he declared, heading for the door. At the threshold, he stopped and turned. "Sophia, whatever secret you're keeping, it doesn't change anything. We're in this together." After he left, Rachel approached Sophia, who had turned her attention back to the paints. "You two seem close," she commented casually. "It's complicated," Sophia responded vaguely. "And the treatment? Are you going to tell him?" Sophia sighed, her hands stopping over the brushes. "After all this is over, now we need to focus on the plan." "Sophia," Rachel hesitated, "are you sure you want to do this? Michael Thornton is dangerous. What happened last time?" "Last time I was alone," Sophia interrupted her. "Now it's different." Rachel observed her friend for a few moments, noticing the change in her posture, the determination in her eyes. "You really care about him, don't you?" Sophia didn't respond immediately, her eyes fixed on the blank canvas in front of her. Finally, with a small smile, she murmured, "Like I said, it's complicated." Picking up her finest brush, Sophia began to work on the giant canvas. She had less than 24 hours to create not just a work of art, but a trap that could expose decades of corruption and lies. And perhaps more importantly, she had to protect the man who, surprisingly, had become much more than just a client. The Grand Hall of Blackwood Enterprises was packed. Board members, journalists, and important figures from the business world occupied every available space. The large canvas, covered by a black cloth, dominated one of the walls, provoking curious whispers among those present. The enormous glass windows let in the late afternoon light, creating an almost theatrical environment. Sophia, in her midnight blue dress, maintained a serene expression in her wheelchair, strategically positioned near the canvas. Jonathan, impeccable, in his grey suit, stood beside her, one hand discreetly resting on the back of her chair. "Are all the sensors positioned?" she murmured, barely moving her lips. "Yes," he responded in the same tone. Rachel confirmed that the special lights were installed according to your specifications. Michael Thornton entered the hall like a king in his domain, accompanied by 2 lawyers, and to many people's surprise, Elizabeth. His eyes scanned the room until they found Sophia and Jonathan, a predatory smile forming on his lips. "What a lovely scene," he commented, approaching. "The disgraced businessman and his hired company. I must say, Jonathan, you've always had good taste in acquisitions." "This meeting is about business, Michael," Jonathan responded coldly. "I suggest we maintain a professional focus." "Oh, but that's exactly what this is about," Michael smiled, gesturing to one of his lawyers, who began distributing folders among the board members. "Look, ladies and gentlemen, at what we've discovered about the true relationship between Jonathan Blackwood and Miss Sophia Carter." Murmurs ran through the hall as people leafed through the documents. Sophia could see carefully prepared sensational headlines: "Millionaire hires disabled artist in suspicious scheme. Old conspiracy resurfaces, the truth behind the Blackwood scandal." "It's a shame," Michael continued, now addressing Sophia directly. "Did you really think you could manipulate Jonathan as you did 3 years ago? Or was it he who manipulated you from the beginning?" "It's interesting how you always try to create narratives that benefit only yourself, Michael," Sophia responded calmly, her voice carrying a strength that made several people pay more attention. "These aren't narratives, my dear," he retorted, his smile faltering slightly. "They're documented facts, just as it's a fact that you and Jonathan planned the entire scandal 3 years ago to divert attention from the real irregularities." It was Sophia's turn to smile. "Are you sure you want to go down that path?" Something in her tone must have alerted Michael, because he hesitated for a moment. But his ego spoke louder. "Ladies and gentlemen," he addressed the audience, "what you see here is the conclusion of a meticulous investigation that proves, without a shadow of a doubt, that the scandal that destroyed Blackwood Enterprises was, in fact, a smokescreen created by Jonathan himself, using an unknown artist as a pawn in his game." "Interesting choice of words," Sophia interrupted, her voice clear and strong. "Especially the part about smokescreen, because you see, Michael, you're not the only one who knows how to play with illusions and revelations." With a precise gesture, she activated a small remote control. The automated blinds began to close, plunging the hall into controlled darkness. "What is this?" Michael demanded, his confidence beginning to waver. "Art," Sophia responded simply. "And truth. Two things you never fully understood." Jonathan gave a signal, and the cloth covering the giant canvas fell, revealing an impressive work, a labyrinth of shapes and colors that seemed to tell multiple stories at the same time. "Beautiful," Michael mocked. "But what does this prove?" "Watch carefully," Sophia smiled, activating another control. Specially positioned ultraviolet lights turned on, and the canvas began to transform before the astonished eyes of those present. Hidden layers of information emerged from the painting: documents, signatures, dates, values, an entire history of corruption and manipulation that pointed directly to Michael Thornton. "Impossible," he whispered, his face losing color. "Every stroke of this painting," Sophia explained to the fascinated audience, "contains verifiable information about the true operations conducted by Michael Thornton over the past 5 years, including," she paused dramatically, "the evidence of how he orchestrated my accident when I first tried to expose his activities." Elizabeth chose this moment to step forward, separating herself from Michael's group. "And I can confirm every word," she declared, removing a flash drive from her purse. "Here are all the original documents that prove Michael's involvement, including his direct orders to forge Jonathan's signature on international contracts." Chaos ensued in the hall. Journalists were flashing cameras. Board members were demanding explanations, and Michael looked like a cornered animal. "You can't prove anything," he shouted, advancing towards the canvas. That's when Sophia stood up from her chair. The movement was so unexpected, so dramatic, that the entire hall plunged into stunned silence. Michael froze midway, his wide eyes fixed on Sophia, who was now standing, supported by Jonathan. "My condition was always temporary, Michael," she explained, her voice laden with contained emotion. "The experimental treatment I started 6 months ago is working, but you were so busy trying to use me as a weapon against Jonathan that you didn't realize I was also playing my own game." You both," Michael stammered, looking frantically between Sophia and Jonathan. "Planned everything?" Jonathan completed, a satisfied smile on his face. "No. In fact, we should thank you, Michael. Your obsession with destroying us ended up uniting us in a way you could never have predicted." At this moment, the doors of the hall opened and federal agents began to enter. Michael looked around, searching for an exit, but he was surrounded. "By the way," Sophia added, still supported by Jonathan, "that maid you bribed to spy on us. She's been working for us for years. Thank you for making all this even more interesting." 6 months later, the garden of the Blackwood mansion was unrecognizable. The old oak trees now shared space with an explosion of colors, flowers of all kinds personally chosen by Sophia, transformed the once austere space into a true oasis of life and beauty. Sophia walked slowly among the flower beds, supported by an artisanal cane that she had painted herself with colorful patterns. Her progress in treatment continued to surprise doctors, although she still needed support for longer distances. Her wheelchair remained stored in the studio, more as a reminder than a necessity. "The exhibition is completely sold out," Rachel commented, accompanying her friend through the garden. "And critics can't stop talking about how you revolutionized contemporary art with your reactive pigment technique." Sophia smiled, stopping to admire a particularly exuberant orchid. "The most important thing is that the resources are helping other people. The Art Without Barriers Foundation has already managed to fund projects for 15 artists with disabilities. And to think it all started with a companionship contract," Rachel laughed. "Speaking of which, where is your former employer?" "Jonathan is in a meeting with the lawyers," Sophia responded, a special gleam in her eyes at the mention of his name. "The company restructuring is almost complete." After the scandal involving Michael Thornton, who was now awaiting trial, the truth about Blackwood Enterprises came to light. Jonathan not only regained his reputation, but decided to completely transform the way he conducted his business. "Miss Sophia," George appeared in the garden, his habitually serious face betraying a small smile. "Mr. Jonathan requests your presence in the studio." Sophia raised an eyebrow, intrigued. Jonathan rarely interrupted her during her gardening sessions, which had become an important part of her physical therapy. As she entered the studio, she found Jonathan standing in front of the canvas of Breaking Mirrors, the first work she had created in the mansion. He had bought it the day after the exhibition that exposed Michael, insisting that it remain exactly where it was painted. "You know," he began without turning, "I've spent a lot of time reflecting on this painting, about how the mirrors weren't just breaking but revealing something new behind." "And what do you see now?" she asked softly, approaching. Jonathan finally turned, and Sophia noticed that he was holding something in his hands, a small blue velvet box. "I see that sometimes we need to let our defenses break to find something true," he responded, his voice laden with emotion. "Sophia, you entered my life through a contract, but you transformed everything I thought I knew about myself." "Jonathan," she began, her heart racing. "Let me finish," he gently requested. "When we met, I was a bitter man, convinced that I could buy everything I needed in life. You showed me that the most important things, respect, trust, love, can't be bought. They need to be earned, cultivated, like the flowers in your garden." He opened the box, revealing a delicate ring with a stone that changed color according to the light, exactly like the special pigments she used in her paintings. "I'm no longer trying to buy companionship," he continued, his voice trembling slightly. "I'm asking for a partnership in every sense, in life, in business, in art, in everything. What do you say?" Sophia looked from the ring to Jonathan, tears shining in her eyes. "You really have changed, you know. The Jonathan from 6 months ago would have prepared an elaborate prenuptial contract." "Oh, but I did," he joked, though his eyes were equally misty. "Rachel helped me draft it. The only clause is that you promise to keep challenging me every day for the rest of our lives." "In that case," she smiled, extending her hand, "I think we can negotiate." As Jonathan slid the ring onto her finger, the sunset light entered through the studio windows, making the stone shine in shades of blue and gold. On the wall, the painting of Breaking Mirrors seemed to come to life, its fragments reflecting no longer loneliness and bitterness, but the promise of a future built on truer foundations. Elizabeth, who was discreetly observing the scene from the studio door, smiled and silently withdrew. Her mission of redemption was complete. Jonathan had found not only love, but his own redemption, and she could finally leave the past behind. In the garden, Rachel was already mentally organizing the press release, imagining how the story of the millionaire transformed by love and art would capture the public's imagination. But she knew that the true story was much deeper. It was about two people who, through their own fragilities and strengths, found a way to complete each other. "So," Sophia murmured against Jonathan's chest after a long kiss, "what happens now?" "Now?" He smiled, caressing her face. "Now we begin our own work of art, together." And so, in the mansion that had once been a symbol of isolation and bitterness, a new story began to be painted. A story of transformation, of second chances, and of the courage to let masks fall to find something truly precious. The sun was setting on the horizon, painting the sky with the same vibrant colors that Sophia used on her canvases. In the studio, a blank canvas waited for the next chapter of their story. No longer a story of loneliness and control, but of partnership and liberation.